The sky over the city turned dark at 11 in the morning, and that is how I knew my life was about to change forever. I was standing behind the counter of my bakery, wiping flour off my hands, when the light outside dimmed, like someone had thrown a blanket over the sun. Cars stopped in the middle of the street. Phones came out. Somewhere down the block, a dog would not stop barking. I stepped outside, still in my apron, and looked up. Ships. Not planes, not clouds, not weather balloons. Ships the size of stadiums, hanging silently above the rooftops, blotting out the sky in long dark shapes that did not move the way anything built by human hands should move. My hands were shaking before my brain even caught up with what my eyes were seeing. And in the middle of the street, surrounded by soldiers in armor that looked grown rather than built, stood a woman I recognized instantly, gray skin, eyes a little too large for her face, a voice that sounded like two people speaking half a syllable apart. 6 hours earlier, she had stolen a croissant from my shop. Her name was Ithri, though I did not know that yet when she walked through my door before sunrise, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big, moving like she was afraid the floor might give way beneath her. I run a small bakery near the edge of town, the kind of place that opens at 5, so the early shift workers can grab something warm before their commute. That morning, the bell above the door rang before I had even flipped the sign to open. She did not say a word. She stared at the pastry case like it held something sacred. Then, in one smooth motion, she reached over the counter, grabbed a croissant, and turned to run. I have dealt with a few people who take something without paying. Usually you shout. Usually you chase them out the door and regret it later because you are wearing an apron and kitchen clogs, not running shoes. But something about the way she held that croissant against her chest, like it was the first good thing to happen to her in a very long time, made me stop. I did not shout. I said, "Come back, sit down. You want coffee with that?" She froze at the door, turned around slowly, like she expected a trap. I was holding a spatula, not a weapon, but she looked at it like I might use it against her. "You are not going to call for enforcement?" she asked. Her voice had that strange layered quality I would later understand was 2 vocal folds working slightly out of sync. "For a croissant," I said. "No. Sit down. You look like you have not eaten in days." She sat. I made her a coffee, more out of habit than thought, and set a plate in front of her with the croissant she had already half destroyed in her grip. She looked at it for a long moment before she took a bite, and when she did, her whole face changed. Her eyes went wide. She made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, like the pastry had personally surprised her. "This," she said, staring at the torn bread in her hand, "should not be allowed to taste this good." I laughed. I had no idea yet that where she came from, some things actually were not allowed. Her name was Ithri, she told me eventually, speaking carefully, like every word cost her something. She said she was between assignments, which I now understand was the understatement of the century. She asked questions the way someone studies for an exam they cannot afford to fail. "How do you make the bread rise like this? Why do you drink the bitter black liquid every morning? Why did you give me food after I stole from you? What do you want from me in return?" That last question stuck with me the most. "Nothing," I told her. "You looked hungry. That is the whole reason." She stared at me for a long moment, like I had said something in a language she did not fully understand, even though the words themselves were simple enough. I did not think much of the oversized coat, or the thin bracelet on her wrist that blinked amber every few minutes, or the way she flinched every time a delivery truck rumbled past outside. I thought, strange woman, interesting conversation, good tipper, because she left behind a smooth gray stone that I later learned was worth more than my entire shop. I went back to my ovens. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. By mid-morning, the street outside was full of people running in every direction, some toward their homes, some simply away from the ships, all of them screaming different versions of the same question. What is happening? I stood frozen on the sidewalk with my apron still tied around my waist, staring up at those dark shapes blotting out the sun, and then I heard a voice. It was not a small voice. It came from everywhere at once, amplified across the entire sky like it was being spoken directly into the bones of the city. "Who took my daughter?" I felt the words in my chest before I understood them. Around me, people dropped to the ground, covering their ears, though the sound was not painful, only enormous. I looked toward the center of the street and saw Ithri standing there, no longer wearing the oversized coat. Now she wore something sleek and dark that made it painfully clear she was not simply a tourist who had wandered into my shop by accident. A craft descended from the largest ship, folding the air around it in a way that made my stomach turn, like the laws of physics were embarrassed to be involved. When it landed, a woman stepped out who made every soldier around her stand a little straighter without saying a word. She was taller than Ithri, sharper in every line of her face, and the moment her eyes found her daughter, something in her posture cracked with relief for exactly one heartbeat before hardening back into fury. "You were taken," she said. It was not a question. "I was fed," Ithri said. The woman's gaze swept the crowd and landed on me. I was still holding a rolling pin, because apparently some habits do not leave you even during the apparent end of the world. Flour was still dusted across my sleeve. I have never in my life felt more like a criminal while dressed for baking. "This primitive," the woman said, her voice cold enough to lower the temperature of the street, "captured a princess of the Vale Dominion." "I did not capture anyone," I said, "and I still do not know where I found the courage, because every part of my body was telling me to run." She stole a croissant. I gave her coffee. That is the entire crime. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind of silence you can feel pressing against your ears. Soldiers around the Empress shifted their stance, and the strange crescent-shaped weapons at their sides made a low humming sound, like they were considering whether or not today was the day they would be used. "Explain," the Empress said, "Croissant." Before I could open my mouth to answer, Ithri stepped forward. She reached into a small bag at her side and pulled out the second pastry I had wrapped up for her earlier that morning, the one I had given her without thinking twice, simply because that is what you do when someone looks like they have had a hard week. "Mother," she said, "on the Dominion, no one gives without expecting something back. Every kindness is a transaction. Every gift comes with a debt attached to it before it even leaves someone's hand. I have never, in my entire life, been given something with nothing expected in return. Not once. Not until today." She broke the croissant in half and held one piece out toward her mother. "This is what they do here," she said. "Not because they knew who I was. They did not know. They did it because I looked hungry, and that was enough of a reason for them." The Empress looked at the offered pastry, the way someone looks at a weapon they do not recognize the shape of, uncertain whether it was safe to touch. Around her, hundreds of soldiers stood perfectly still, waiting for a signal that had not yet come. She took it. She ate it, in one careful motion, the way you might approach something you suspected could still be a trick, even after it was already in your hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. The whole street held its breath. Then her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the smallest release of tension I have ever witnessed carry that much weight. "This," she said slowly, "is unreasonably good." I would like to say the tension disappeared after that, but it did not all at once. What followed were hours that felt like days. Officials from my own government arrived, terrified and out of their depth, trying to communicate with an empire that could level our cities without much effort. Advisors on both sides argued in tones sharp enough to cut. At one point, a man in a gray suit, who introduced himself as someone from the State Department, leaned close to me and asked, quietly, if I understood what I had started. I told him the truth. I did not start anything. I fed someone who looked hungry. That was all. The Empress, whose name I would later learn was Cyril, though almost no one dared to speak it directly to her, spent the rest of that day walking through my small bakery, with an expression I can only describe as deeply suspicious of joy. She picked up pastries and turned them over in her hands, like they might be hiding something. She asked question after question, the same hunger for understanding that her daughter had shown me hours earlier, except sharper, colder, more careful. "Why does bread rise?" she asked me directly, standing in my kitchen while soldiers waited outside the door, careful not to let their weapons brush against the shelves of flour and sugar. "Yeast," I told her. "Little living things that eat sugar and produce air. It is not complicated. It just takes time and patience. Time and patience, she repeated, like the words themselves were foreign concepts on her world. On the Dominion, patience is a weakness. We take what we need, we do not wait for it to rise on its own. And yet, I said, careful with every word, you are standing in a bakery instead of standing over ruins. Something about waiting seems to have worked out for us today. She looked at me for a long time after that. I could not read her expression, not fully, but something in it had shifted since the morning, since the sky had first gone dark. It took 3 days for the fleet above the city to pull back to a distance where people stopped panicking every time they looked up. It took 3 weeks for an actual agreement to be reached, one that involved ambassadors and translators, and a great deal of careful, exhausting negotiation that I was, somehow, invited to be part of, mostly because both sides insisted on it. The humans wanted someone they trusted in the room. The Dominion, strangely enough, wanted the same thing, and the only person both sides trusted even slightly was the baker who had fed their princess a croissant and asked for nothing in return. I sat through meetings that lasted longer than I thought possible, listening to generals and diplomats argue over borders and resources and the terms of what they eventually called first contact, though it felt more like first negotiation to me. Ithri sat beside me through most of it, translating not just words but meaning, catching the moments when a phrase from one side would land wrong on the other. You looked terrified that first day, she told me once, during a break between sessions, when we were standing near a window overlooking the city. I was terrified, I said. I still am, most days. You did not act like it. Acting terrified does not usually help, I told her. It just makes the fear worse. I figured if I was going to be scared, I might as well be useful while I was at it. She smiled at that, the layered, double-toned sound of her laughter, something I had grown used to by then, something that no longer startled me the way it had the first time I heard it. The Empress visited my bakery 3 more times before the fleet finally left orbit. Each time, she came with fewer soldiers, and each time, she left with more questions. On her last visit, she stood at the counter and asked me, directly, why I had given her daughter food without knowing who she was. Because she was hungry, I said again, the same answer I had given from the very beginning. It has not changed. It is not going to change no matter how many times you ask. On my world, she said slowly, choosing her words with visible care, kindness given freely is treated as a sign of weakness. A ruler who gives without demanding something back is seen as unfit to rule. I have spent my entire life believing that to be true. And now? I asked. Now, she said, I have eaten bread made by hands that expected nothing from me, offered by a species I came here prepared to conquer. I do not yet know what to do with that. She left without another word, but she did not order her fleet to attack. Instead, 3 days later, the first official ships from the Dominion arrived not with weapons raised, but with delegations, chefs among them, sent specifically to learn what they called the human art of unearned generosity. I remember laughing when I first heard that phrase, because to me, it was not an art at all. It was just what you did when someone needed a meal. Ithri visits often now. She comes without guards, without the coat she used to hide behind, because there is no need to hide anymore. Everyone in the city knows exactly who she is. Children wave at her on the street. Shop owners save her the last pastry of the day, the same way I once did without knowing what it would lead to. A few weeks after everything settled, she sat across from me in my kitchen, watching me fold dough the way I had shown her a dozen times by then, though she still could not quite get the technique right. You know, she said, without looking up from the dough in her hands, you could have been executed that day, or you could have started a war that ended everything for your entire planet. All of that, over a stolen pastry. Worth it, I told her, and I meant it completely. She looked up at me then, flour dusted across her fingers, her expression somewhere between amusement and something softer that I did not have a word for yet. Yes, she said, it really was. I still run the same small bakery near the edge of town, though it looks different now. There is a private landing area behind the building, where smaller Dominion craft occasionally arrive, discreet enough that most of my regular customers barely notice anymore. The Empress sends a message every few months asking about new recipes, always phrased like a demand, though I have learned by now that it is simply how she shows interest in something she genuinely enjoys. Sometimes, in the quiet hour before opening, when the ovens are just beginning to warm and the smell of butter and yeast fills the shop, I think back to that morning. A woman in an oversized coat, stealing a single croissant because she was hungry and had nowhere else to turn. I think about how close everything came to falling apart, how a single decision, made without much thought at all, ended up changing the course of two entire worlds. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I wish I had simply let her go that morning instead of calling her back, instead of offering coffee to a stranger who had just robbed me. I always give them the same answer. I did not know she was a princess. I did not know an empire was waiting above our sky, ready to turn our cities into rubble over what they believed had happened to her. I only knew that someone walked through my door looking like they had not eaten in days, and I had bread to spare. That was the whole reason. It still is. And every morning, when the bell above my door rings before the sun has fully risen, I find myself hoping it is someone else who needs exactly that.